James chapter 5, verses 1 through 6 is our study today. James repeats the same introductory words that he did back in chapter 4, verse 13, when he says, "Come now." You remember we speculated in our last video that maybe those two words, plus the absence of two other words, "my brethren," may lead some to the conclusion that in this section, James is not so much addressing the Christians as he had in earlier text, but that he is addressing the worldly rich. He says here in chapter 5, verse 1, "Come now, you rich." Now remember, he had already said back in chapter 2, in verse 16, of the rich, back in chapter 2, verse 6, he had said, "But you have dishonored the poor man who had come into their assembly, as opposed to the wealthy man that they had given preference to, that you have dishonored the poor man." And then he asked this question, "Do not the rich oppress you and drag you into the courts?" And so the rich that he talked about earlier were not Christians, but actually non-Christians, and non-Christians that had been oppressing these Christians. And so could he be addressing those same people here? And maybe not so much addressing them in the sense that they would be reading this epistle or would even listen to the words of a preacher like James anyway, but addressing them in the ear of these Christians, talking to or about these worldly rich people who were oppressing them, and doing so in front of these poor Christians and giving them some hope. Let's see if that makes sense as we read through our text today. So he says, "Come now, you rich, weep and howl for your miseries that are coming upon you." So again, that doesn't sound like language addressed to believing Christians, but to these worldly oppressors, these worldly wealthy persecutors of these Christians, that they will receive their day in court, we would say. For the miseries that are coming upon you, your riches are corrupted, and your garments are moth-eaten. Now, does the statement, "your riches," imply that not all wealth is evil, that some were properly using their wealth, but not these, because their riches were corrupted and their garments were moth-eaten? Your gold and silver are corroded, and their corrosion will be a witness against you and will eat your flesh like fire. You've heaped up treasure in the last days. Now their wealth, their riches were corrupted, moth-eaten, and corroded. That maybe speaks to two things. Number one is to the fleeting nature of these things. Remember, Jesus had talked about those who would lay up for themselves treasures on earth where moth and rust would consume and thieves break through and steal. So he may be saying of their wealth that their wealth is not lasting, that it will not endure into eternity. But also the fact that their riches were corrupted, their garments were moth-eaten, and especially that their gold and silver were corroded, may imply that they were hoarding their wealth, rather than putting it out into circulation so that it could help others and using it as a blessing to others, that they were greedily hoarding their wealth, and that was causing it to be moth-eaten and corroded. And in heaping up these treasures, they were actually heaping up treasures in the last days, treasure that would testify against them on the day of judgment. He says in verse 4, "Indeed, the wages of the laborers who mowed your fields, which you kept back by fraud, cry out, The cries of the reapers have reached the ears of the Lord of Sabaoth. And so here is the testimony against you. These riches that you've hoarded or heaped up, they will speak against you in the last days. The wages of the laborers that you have fraudulently held back and stolen from those that work for you, they'll cry out. They'll cry out in the last day, in the day of judgment. They will cry out as testimony against you, because these people that you've mistreated, these reapers, their cries have reached to the ears of the Lord of Sabaoth. Sabaoth means the Lord of hosts. The Lord of avenging armies has heard the cry of those that you've mistreated. Verse 5, you lived on earth in pleasure and luxury, and you fattened your hearts as at a day of slaughter. In your greed and selfishness and holding back wages and in mistreating others, you have fattened yourself through this wealth. But like that animal that's been pinned up and being fed just to be slaughtered like the fatted calf, that's all this fattening, all this hoarding, selfishly, greedily holding back these wages. That's all that's done, has fattened you up for slaughter. The wealth that they'd held back greedily, selfishly, was not going to be of any benefit to them in that day of judgment. All it was going to be testimony against them. You have condemned, verse 6 says, you have murdered the just, and he does not resist you. The he here is the just. The Christians that they had mistreated are the other good people who had been murdered and condemned and mistreated by them. They could not resist them because of their power and their wealth. But all this was doing was fattening them up for the day of slaughter. Now, this whole section has been addressed to, I believe, the wealthy, ungodly people who were mistreating these Christians. And James is saying this in the ear of those Christians as a means of comfort of those who are being mistreated. What a comfort it would have been to hear James, by inspiration, condemn those rich people right in front of them, to condemn those rich people who were mistreating them, who were fraudulently keeping back their wages, who were dragging them into court and testifying against them. And if we're to take the language literal, we're condemning and murdering the just. These godly Christians were unable to resist them, but they needed to hear that all this was doing was heaping up treasure for these wealthy people in the last days. Treasure that would cry out and testify against them before a loving and righteous God. Puts things into perspective to remember that there is a day of reckoning coming.